Good morning, everybody. I'm doing another early video where I kind of wanted to just really pray, but I was up early. I'm getting up very early again. And I'm going to cover, each night I'm reading a chapter of Judges, and then a little bit of the New Testament. I might hit on Philippians 1, showing you the theme of Paul. The theme of, there's a verse if I forget, but Paul says, I want you to know, he said, the things that happened unto me, he said, happens for the furtherance of the gospel. And so you too would be bold. Paul says, because of his chains, his imprisonment, he said, many others now are bold, okay? And there was an aspect of the sufferings of Paul, and then he also, Paul makes requests a lot. I'm going to do Judges in a second. But he says that I may speak boldly. I may speak boldly. And in the church, the thing that prevents us, I might even hit on, I'm almost done with, I got behind on some of my reading. And I wasn't sure if this is, I'm going to try and finish this one by Darrell Bach, The Missing Gospels. I'm going to do a little more teaching like you've heard me in the past. There's a few things I would like to maybe mention from some of that too. Let me do the Judges chapter I read last night. I was wanting to slow down and wait because I got many videos, so I'm going to have to work on like trying to upload one every day. And so if I read a chapter at night, every night I'm reading a few. But this one I like. Now, Gideon is one of the judges that, you know, you have a little bit more of his story told. You see that like with the life of Samson. And so some of the judges in the book of Judges in the Old Testament, these are the deliverers that God raises up throughout the history of the nation of Israel. They come under oppression in the land that God gave as an inheritance, which we call the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. But because of disobedience and stuff, they come under judgment, and these various groups oppress them. And so in this case, you have the Midianites. And I think on the last video, I mentioned a little bit on chapter 6. So God raises up Gideon. So now Gideon is called to deliver the people from the oppression of the Midianites, because every year the people of God, the nation of Israel, they were planting and they were doing their work, and the Midianites would come up at that certain harvest season and all and just rake the land. They were like oppressive. Scripture talks about, there's many of the things you hear me discuss, but Scripture talks about those who wait, those who set traps, those who pursue, and a lot of the things. When you deal with corruption, a lot of these cases you hear me deal with. When I talked about the Gideon case, which I will continue to speak about, what came out in the paper was they basically knew they needed to solve that crime because it was a bad crime. They didn't have the evidence. And maybe those cops or detectives and the prosecutor, maybe they thought, well, maybe it's him, this kid. But as the trial progressed, you could see, no, they lied. But they figured, let's go anyway. If it ever comes out that we coerced false testimony, we lied, we did all these criminal acts, the DA and the detectives in this case, but they figured, let's move ahead with the system. And once the system moves ahead, we'll get this kid's ass, capital murder, send him for life. And the kid's crying in court. It wasn't him. They said, but let's just do it. And then if it gets overturned, at least we came on him with all the force and authority that we had, though we lied and we used false testimony. They even tried to get another witness in that case to lie, and that was the other kid who stood up in court in another proceeding and said, they're trying to get me to frame him. That's exactly what they did. But in the Gideon case, they figured, let's do it. They did that with Hannah Overton. They lied about the doctor's findings, that the kid really did have the pica, but they figured, let's hit this woman. let's hit it with all we got. After all, we're getting salaries, we're getting paid. You know, I tell you about these criminal acts by police. I'm testifying to you by the word of God that these things are true. And it was common, and it was known, and it was ongoing. Felony things. You know, I had guys come to me, my friends, over years of this stuff. And I'm sure the officer went to these guys. I know because Dirk came once, and he just came like with a message. John, you know, the reason the cops fought, this was Dirk's message. John, you know, the cops one time were following me all the time, John. Dirk. He probably had reason to be followed. But he said, but then they told me, well, Dirk, we're only following you all the time. It's because you're hanging out with all these other homeless guys. Well, Dirk is actually one of them. And I knew that somebody asked Dirk, please go tell that to John, because John knew that that guy followed my ass. And I said, you son of a bitch, you shouldn't be doing that shit. And then I knew, because Huey was busted one time by this officer. We know, everybody knows everybody here. And I got mad, I complained about it at the time. I said, I hope he didn't bust my friend. And I know who busted Huey. I know, because his brother David told me so-and-so busted my brother last night, and strong cop. And as a favor, Huey came over to my house for this cop. He said, go tell John, you know, tell John somebody else arrested you. And Huey was here that day. I told this story before. He kept saying, you know, when Lieutenant Alvarez arrested me, I knew it wasn't Lieutenant Alvarez. And then later I called him, and I told this before. Because when I came back from one of my New Jersey trips, we were at the halfway house. I said, oh, who busted you again? And he forgot. I said, I know who busted you. So he had various, why? Why was that cop doing that? Because he knew that I was speaking out. That's why he did that. He knew I was saying, no, you ain't going to be, you know, you're not going to do what you did to all these other guys all these years. An angel told me once, Angel Hanley, who has relationship, friendship and all with this officer. And some of the other guys told me, oh yeah, but John, he actually trains as martial arts, and because he beat the shit out of my friend Crow. Okay, Crow, sorry I had to use your name, brother. But they all know it's him anyway. I didn't want to use it. That's his nickname. So they said, oh, he knows how to fight. Better be careful. An angel said once, he told one other guy, I'll take my uniform off and I'll beat the shit out of you. Angel told me that officer said that to somebody else. So I knew he had a history of all this. And you figure you throw the whole weight of everything. And when you manipulate the system like that, and you do whatever you did with the DAs and the detectives, you think you had a shooting last night, a murder yesterday, a woman 31 years old by a bar, and so they're out looking for the person, and initially they said it was the ex-husband. Now I watched it on the news, they don't know who it is. Detective says, we're working the case. Now let me ask you, just because of what was just come out in the paper, how you worked the Gaetan case, who can trust you? Who can trust you? You use manipulation. Even Roger. Roger is an alcoholic friend of mine for many years out here. I forget, Roger's German, I forget his last name. But I've helped Roger for many years. But Roger one time got fed up with this officer after many, many years. And he said something in HEB, like a threat. And this officer charged him with a terroristic threat, and Roger did about 5 years in prison. And even the street guys said, you know, he took away 5 years of Roger's life. You say, but he shouldn't have said that. I said to my friends, you know, you're right, he shouldn't have said it. But that officer has said it to you guys and has done things to you guys. But yet he wanted to hold my firm responsible for a slip of the tongue. And he took that guy, charged him with that he threatened to murder the officers, what he charged him with. But yet that same officer not only made threats, but carried him out, openly and publicly. But even Roger did him a favor, because that was famous. Tommy Nichols busted Roger. Tommy Nichols made Roger do 5 years in Tommy Nichols. That was very famous. And then one day Roger said at Timmons, and he gave a name of another officer. He said, when the other officer arrested me and I had to do the 5 years, so even Roger did him a favor. Because that officer said, tell John that somebody else will retire. Now, that's because these other guys were going to go out of their way and do him a favor. Because they all know each other. To me, was never an issue of just, we have dealing with the supervisory problem within a fire department. These are crimes when you do that. When you plant Xanax and all. These are crimes. And the jail system, maybe, to this officer was, out of anger, I'm going to put this so-and-so in jail with the Xanax or lie about this or that. Because to them, it's no big thing. But when they get close to themselves possibly having to go to prison, they almost cry. Say, now, do you understand what you did in your supervisor? And you let that go on. And you say, why do people not trust that system? Now, in the story of Gideon, God's going to call him, and he has, I could read a little bit of it. The Lord said unto Gideon, you have too many people. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them there for thee. Now, what happened was Gideon was going to go fight the Midianites, the oppressors. And he had about 23,000 people, and God said, that's too many. And so God does, and he says it's too many because if you have victory with all those people, you're going to say, we did this. Our hand has done this. And God says, I don't want you to take the glory for the deliverance. So there's a little test. They go down. They have to drink the water a certain way. But God, initially Gideon says, everybody that's afraid, everyone that's fearful, let him return. And they returned to the people 22,000. So the first test out of the army, how many they had, 20-something thousand, all he said was, okay, everybody that's afraid, go home. 22,000 left. It was pretty good. The congregation went down fast. And then they had about 10,000. And at the end, God says, I'm going to let you do this battle with 300. Now, Gideon also himself is hesitant, fearful. And God permits him to sneak into the Midianite camp and to hear what they're saying. And so he goes down and he hears one guy tell another guy, I had a dream. These are the enemy now talking, and Gideon's listening in. One guy tells the other guy, I had a dream, and I dreamed a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian, and came unto a tent and smote it that it fell, and overturned the tent. Now these are the enemies talking. They don't know Gideon's listening. And the guy tells their dream to his friend. And the other friend answered and said, this is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, for into his hand has God delivered Midian. Well, Gideon hears all the enemy are actually fearful of him. And Gideon's like, oh, I didn't know those guys were afraid of me. And so that was already God moving. And Gideon worships and says, oh, now we're going to be able to take it. So Gideon figures, now remember, he heard the words of that dream. To the enemies, the dream meant to them that they had, God gave them a dream. To them it meant, this is the sword of Gideon. But notice something interesting. Even though I didn't get a chance to study it, I would have looked into it a little more, but I'll share just what I got when I read it last night. So, Gideon gets his 300 men, and he understands that the battle is the Lord's because they're already afraid of him. And so he says, this is what we're going to do. Take these little pots or pitchers and these little lamps and take these trumpets, all 300 of you. And we'll divide into 3 separate companies, 100 each. And they're going to surround the camp, which they do. This is Judges chapter 7. And Gideon says, at a certain time, I'm going to blow the trumpet, but we're all going to break these jars, these clay pots, pitchers, and we're going to show every one of us the lamps, and all of us are going to blow the trumpets. And normally, in these battles in the Old Testament, everybody doesn't blow trumpets. It's like the leader, you're blowing the trumpets for the war and all. But if you hear 300 trumpets, you're going to think, wow, there must be thousands and thousands, because the Midianites are thinking each trumpet is, a company coming. So Gideon doesn't really have the resources in the natural to win this battle. But the fear of the Lord is in those people. They're afraid of Gideon. But Gideon says, and when you blow, he's got his men, he says, and when you break those clay jars and you hold up your lamps and you blow those trumpets, yell, the sword of the Lord in Gideon. And in the dream, the Midianites didn't dream the sword of the Lord or didn't interpret it that way. They just said the sword of Gideon. But Gideon understood that God was saying that you can't take the glory for the battle. So he had his men say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Now, they're already all afraid of that very thing, the sword of Gideon. They had the dream. And it says, all these mighty Midianites, all these oppressors, we got all this equipment to go after you, to manipulate, to hit you, to make false testimony against the Christian woman missionary. Who cares? We'll hit her with all we got, make her cry in court, your children crying their asses off, and we lied. So what? Once we hit you, you called yourself you're fighting crooks. You are a criminal by doing that. You're a criminal by doing those things. Don't ever try and deceive anybody in the city and say, our detectives were investigating. You manipulate, you use false testimony, and then you laugh about that. Get those kids crying in court. I didn't do it, I swear to it, and you knew they didn't do it. And then you run around, putting Xanax on people, beating the shit out of people, telling people straight up, officers telling people straight up, we'll hit you like a brick of walls, you mother effer, we'll beat the shit out of people in this city. You threaten people like that. You do that, CCPD. And you're so proud of that. And everybody in this bluff knows that you do that. Everybody in this bluff knows, and you know that was going on for all those years. You thought it was funny. Those are crimes that you're committing. And you want the public to think your detectives are working on a case? So, they blow the trumpets, they break, and it says, and they stood every man in the camp, and all the hosts ran and cried and fled. And as they blew the trumpets, and they all killed each other. They were all crying, oh no, it's Gideon, he's coming, he's on the way. They're all turning against one another. God gave victory. It says the snare, the trap that they laid, they got caught in that trap. Pursuers, watching, getting their little 24 hours, not law enforcement, 24 hours manipulation, crime, and going after people. You wonder why people don't show up at your door when you call 911? So, it was a great victory that God gave. I wanted to read one more. Philippians, I'll just hit it. I just began reading it. I thank my God, chapter 1, upon every remembrance of you, always making mention of you in my prayers. Paul praying for the church. This I pray, your love may abound more and more, and being filled with all righteousness, the fruits of righteousness which are by Jesus Christ. But I would that you would understand that the things that happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in the palace and in all places. And many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. See, others had to see that they became bold because they saw Paul willing to speak. And the main thing that prevents us from being bold is the fear of death. The fear of death, because that's the ultimate threat people put on you. We'll come after you, we'll do that, we'll use the whole system to get you. For I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and supply of the Spirit of Jesus. Me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And Paul says, this is why I might mention some of the book I'm reading. I'm in a strait betwixt the two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful. And in nothing, don't be terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a sign of judgment, perdition, but to you of salvation and that of God. For it is given in the behalf of Christ not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. Okay? And I can't do too much of the other thing because I got 21 minutes, but Paul says, one of the things I would just hit here at the end is, it's the fear of man, says, that brings a snare. And it's fear that keeps people in oppression. But then when they want to have a voice, and they feel that their voice can be effective, in Iraq, they just had recently, there's a lot of worldlings issues going on, but they just had a bunch of people storm the parliament building in the green zone in Iraq, which is a safe zone. But they didn't go in and do a lot of terrorism or anything, though ISIS now has done a couple bombs. But these are people protesting, actual Iraqis protesting the corruption of the government that the United States basically installed in that country. And it's corrupt. And so, but they felt they had a voice. Yesterday in the paper, watch the Russia world situation, but it's very interesting because when Russia initially went into Syria to back up Assad, the president of Syria, who the majority of the people voted in, and that wasn't a fake election, they support him because they know if he's removed like the U.S. said he should be, that place will fall apart. But when Russia went in, Obama, I remember, said, well, he's getting into a quagmire. He's getting into sort of like, look, there's a mess there. And Russia went in and said, look, the only way we're going to solve it is we're going to have to go in and kind of back up Assad, which he's an ally. And then Obama kind of sat back and said, well, watch everything fall apart. What kind of foreign policy is that? So then when Russia pulled out, which they did, but they're still putting anti-aircraft missiles and everything, they're getting ready to tell the U.S., you're now violating a sovereign nation by flying. I'm telling you, Russia's they're going to give an ultimatum to the U.S. and say, stop flying. And it's going to be like an ultimatum. And there might be a proxy war, Russia and the U.S., right in over Syria. But the headline of the paper now, being Russia had pulled out a lot of the troops, was, and this was an Associated Press article, John Kerry and Obama asking Russia, we need Russia's help. Please help us, with the ceasefire, which we obviously won't. But if anybody just looked at what's going on there, they realize that we don't know what we're doing, and we ourselves are in a quagmire in a sense. Now we're saying to Russia, after telling them a month ago, you're getting into something and watch, you're going to go, and now we're saying, please help us. Please help us, Russia. Look, Russia's an ally to Assad. They're doing what they said they were going to do. They didn't do what we wanted them to do, and now we're saying, please help us, because some serious things took place, and you did have a bombing of another Doctors Without Borders hospital. We bombed one in Afghanistan, in the city of Kunduz, and the official report did come out this week, and there's questions. There's questions. But Syria, not Russia, but the Syrian planes bombed one in Aleppo. Doctors Without Borders Hospital. So it's a very, very bad situation there. The purpose of God is to deliver and to save. And even when we read these battles in the book of Judges, don't ever mistake that the purpose of God somehow is going to be accomplished through violence and military. That's not what these stories are meaning to us. Today we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. So it's not a fleshly battle, okay? As a matter of fact, I put that verse, I painted it on the wall outside. That's why in the last video I was looking for the verse, and it came from one of my Old Testament readings. I think maybe one of the prophets I read, but it said the stars in their courses fought. Maybe it was from Judges I read, maybe in the thing of Deborah, but it said the stars in their courses fought. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. The stars also in Scripture represent things. I saw a star fall from heaven. Jesus said, I saw Satan as lightning fall from heaven. So there's a spiritual battle that goes on, all right? And when you see me discuss these things, you say, oh, John, these are unsubstantiated things. No, there were so many for so long. And all I ever said was, you got this going on with officers out here, and everyone in this Gideon case, and everyone in these articles that the Corpus Times is doing, everyone could see. Everyone can see. They're now, the Corpus Times, they usually call the DA's office whenever they have questions, who is Mark Skirka, but he's not answering or talking to the Caller Times anymore. So I noticed now they went back to the former DA when they want to ask questions. His name is Grant Jones, so they probably called him up and said, well, Skirka, I would assume, I don't know how much more would need to be seen about false testimony, constant, all these things, before something's done. But you see, if you're seeking to get some of these cases, these guys on death row, and then they've found that they manipulated even in those, and they're like all going before judges, all going by, but the judge didn't grant a release. There comes a time where you recognize, actually, this system of man's court system is a failure. It's an abysmal failure. And when you wonder what has given these ISIS people, what has given them this desire to now just come out and fight? A big part of it was years of actual oppression that took place. And in many of the countries they live in, our involvement when we sided with leaders of Saudi Arabia or Egypt or whoever, and those people were very oppressive. And the U.S. empowered them through these alliances we had for oil and other reasons. And finally, after generations, there was a radical element that said, now you can do something. You're tired of complaining. You got no regress at your courts. And there was something within that revolt that they felt, we'll give our lives, because now we feel like it's no longer us in these cases of ISIS and all. They felt like it's no longer us trying to get the system to be corrected in our countries, that we're raising up our own, if you will, revolt, our own state. That's what it talks about, the Islamic State. That's the whole concept of ISIS. It said now we're raising up our own government. And many of us don't understand that in this country, even though that's what we did. Not in the same manner, but we revolted against the crown. That our independence as a country was based upon, we're not going to try and seek regress at the British courts and have a voice in Parliament, no taxation, representation. We basically said as a country, you know what? And it empowered us to fight for independence. It empowered us. In the natural, There was no way we should have ever been able to defeat the British, the English Army, Navy, the strongest, and we did. And in the natural, you would have thought there's no way that would have ever happened. But it was independence. We felt like, and that's debated in history whether it was right, but you know where we are now. And so, in humanity, if people feel like now we're in this case of Gideon that we're talking about, when everybody saw Gideon and the boldness, Paul himself, then they began to say, oh, so we don't have to always sit back and take oppression. We don't have to. We too have a voice. We don't have to sit back and know, oh, I'm being oppressed. This is happening. The Black Lives Matter movement is the youth that have experienced a lot of this, where many of you just don't think it goes on, it does. And now they felt empowered. That's what was tapped into. That's why the ISIS, that's why they get so many recruits and all. They finally said, we got tired of even corruption within our countries and the involvement of Western nations. So some of those protests they have, some of their grievances are righteous grievances, which the Western world has no idea. We say in the Western media, ooh, they just, want to kill just because they hate our way of life. I posted the letter of bin Laden that he wrote. CNN was the organization that published it at the time, years back. But you should read that letter. I posted it a while back. And bin Laden said, I want you to understand America. And he gave the case. You said, well, we shouldn't listen to. Well, they ain't going away. And it's a revolt that an aspect of their rebellion is rooted in grievances that are actual grievances that tap into a sense of injustice. That's what's empowering that. And we don't see that. And even Christians in our country, in the Western world, that say, well, the answer is let our military just go kill. You're not understanding it. Because we will never be able to wipe them out in that manner. Ever. You ain't going to kill an ideology like that. Okay? So, we're going to need wisdom. I think we went long enough. I'll do my prayer. Let me just pray. Father, I thank you for all of our friends, and I pray for each one. I pray, like Paul said, that people would see that they too have a voice. And Jesus said to us, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot do anything to our soul. But we're to fear God, who has the power to kill and then to cast the soul into hell to bring judgment. And so help us, God, to just move on to know you and to fear you. And for all of our people, that light, God, would shine upon this place here. All these things that are going on, that are injustices, that we see, even in our county here. We ask for the light to shine. We ask for the light to shine. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for you will inherit all nations.